Bolivinaka, everyone. I offer my humble respect to the Turanga Tuisulva and the ancestors of the land on which we speak. It does feel a little strange to be in a conference space and to be so acutely aware of the cultural energy. And in that same spirit, it feels very strange for me to be standing while you both sit. So I do beg your indulgence. Marama Rokotu Indraketi, it's wonderful to see you again. All the traditional leaders in the house and members of the community, Professor Va'ai, and the wonderful keynote presenters, thank you so much for inspiring us and for sharing your reflections with us. And of course, to the youth in the room. I have to apologize. I grew up in a multicultural family in Fiji. I saw yesterday in the video when Teresa was introducing the program for today, and she said I was from Tonga. I'm from Fiji. I have links to Samoa, to Vanuatu, to Fiji, to Levuka. I also have some links to the Middle East and to India. I didn't grow up with all of these stories. The stories in my home were predominantly Samoan. The languages in the home were Samoan and Fijian. I also heard Vakatabu a lot. I heard Hindustani a lot. I even heard Arabic and Urdu. But I was the youngest child. My parents told me that I was an accident. My mother was 39 and my father was 49 when they had me, so it was kind of like, oh, what happened? And my siblings and my cousins, who were much older than I am, did not do well at school. And so even though our home was a wonderful cultural space where you had these wonderful languages spoken and the cultural experience, I learned to understand but was not allowed to speak. So I was told, speak in English and do well at school. And my mother, of course, would be very proud that I went on to get a PhD because I would have done her proud. But as an adult, I can't help but feel that I have lost something. And I told myself I wouldn't be emotional, but anyway, it is what it is. But it's really a privilege to be able to talanoa with all of you today. And like so many others, I've amended our presentation a little bit. The paper, of course, will maintain, so Kasi, don't be worried, concerned. The paper will maintain the original abstract and the description, but just looking at the room and listening to the conversations that we've had in the last 2 days and asking ourselves, how can we contribute to this important conversation? How can we give some meaning and some value into this important space? Dr. Seula Johansson Fua is from Tonga. She's unable to be with us today, but she will be an author, co-author on the final paper. And unfortunately, my colleague Albert, so if you look at the publication booklet, the third colleague was Albert, who unfortunately had to withdraw due to other commitments. I grew up in a home where, as David so eloquently reminded us, the dead are not gone. They're still around us. They've simply taken on a different form. And everything happens for a reason. And so when bad things were to happen, there would be these conversations in the home that there's a reason. And so initially, I thought, well, it's very unfortunate that Albert could not join us, but because I believe that things happen for a reason, I'm very lucky to have with me here today Taitusi, who is a respected colleague. Taitusi brings with him a wealth of experience in the culture sector and in education, and I think that this was meant to be. We hope that our presentation might offer some hope and some reflection on how we might do development better. Kasi asked me for a poem. For those of you who don't know me, I sometimes write poetry and play with paint. And so I tried to find something that spoke to the theme of Vakatabu and the discussions that we've been having in the last 2 days. So my poem is about genealogy and learning to listen. And I apologize, my poem is in English. The old people say land and blood connects us. Root systems reach out through and between us like invisible hands. They say we are naturally drawn to those that we are connected to. The blood song is a gentle hum, like the ocean in our veins. I think the men in my family, in my genealogical tree, are trying to tell me something. Sometimes when I'm tired, caught somewhere between awake and dream, I catch a frequency and tune in to a faraway conversation. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I sat up and listened. It was a serious conversation, a phono perhaps. I remember lying there for hours, trying to make sense of the words that I could understand and piece together. Do you remember when we were kids and we would make those string telephones with plastic cups and strings? It sounded like that, like a bad radio reception connecting to something that happened a long time ago. The second time it happened, it was the sound of a Fijian village, conversations and laughter, and the echo of men talking. The old people say the spirits exist in the same world that we do, another dimension to reality that Western science cannot verify. There's a disconnect between the ocean of eyes that only see in scattered dreams of fish, blue and green like the rain. Mana maps a root system without words that grounds our knowing to the stories that feed us. The old people say land and blood connects us. Root systems reaching out like invisible hands. They say we are naturally drawn to those we are connected to. The blood song is a gentle hum, like the ocean in our veins, and everything is connected. And if we learn to listen, we will never be lost. So our presentation today is titled Rethinking the Pacific Way of Development, and we'll use our time to talanoa and spend some time thinking about how we might do things better. So I have to apologize again. In true cultural style, we just seem to be constantly apologizing, don't we? But I want to apologize in advance because our talanoa is not a creative story. And we heard brilliant creative stories. I particularly enjoyed Kabini's story of Sarah yesterday. But it's a development story. And development stories are not very exciting. But they offer us some lessons and some reflections that we bring to the table in this spirit of sharing and hope that it might help us think about the theme for today, Bulambula, on our strategies, methods, and tools. How might we do things better? So we want to start with the word development itself. We've all been talking about development, but it's one of those words that we struggle to translate. For many of us, development means changing who we are, to be more like the Western world. We have, as Professor Anne reminded us this morning, inherited this from colonialism and from the early violent experiences of Christianity and missionization. Our ancestors were told that to be like us was to be less than. They used words like native, primitive, heathen, ungodly, and they told us that our values and our ways of seeing the world and being in the world was not good enough, that we were not good enough, that if we want to progress, we need to become like them. We've heard other presenters talk about colonial legacies and the capitalist development mindset that's based on the economy. And so if we think about Fiji, today we might be an independent nation, but we know that the influence of external forces is still strong. We can see this influence through globalization and geopolitics. All these developed nations who are interested in the region for so many different reasons: political interests, military interests, and economic interests. We also know that the dependency and politics of aid means that we are constantly dancing a fine line with the developed world. On the one hand, we're seeking financial security, and on the other, we say we want self-determination. And so Ellen Glasgow is famously quoted as saying, "All change is not growth, as all movement is not forward." We can also say, all progress is development, but all development is not progress. And I'm sure that each one of us has more than one story about how development has failed us. We have been taught to think about development from an economic perspective, and we measure that progress by GDP and economic growth, and we look at specific social indicators that we've borrowed from the West. And these indicators are meant to tell us how we're doing in comparison with the rest of the world. They don't simply ask us how we're doing and what is the quality of life. But what if we thought about development as building stronger societies, where we were able to see the impact on quality of life, on strength and resilience of our families, of our communities? What if we could experience it on a personal and community level? Professor Kabini's wonderful story yesterday about Sarah and his reflections on everyday leadership reminds us that development is not just something that happens over there. It's not just something that happens to us. We can be an active part of the process, and we all have a part to play. So our Talanoa begins with our shared Pacific story. We've heard other presenters share examples of how we see the world differently, our values, our ecological relationships, what it means to live in balance, and our concept of time. The wonderful Hawaiian scholar Manulani Maya reminds us that Indigenous people experience the world differently. In a conversation that I had with her 2 weeks ago in Honolulu, she said, "You know what the real problem is? We don't ask the right questions. We need to learn how to ask the right questions." So what are the questions? Our development story is overshadowed by models of development and growth that were developed elsewhere, in and for contexts that are very different from our own. And for the longest time, we didn't question it. We assumed they were good for us because we didn't know that we could try something different. We didn't know what questions to ask. In education, Reverend Va'ai referred to a concept that I had discussed with the philosophies course a week ago, and it's a concept called the culture gap. The culture gap refers to the difference in expectation. So if the home culture has similar expectations to what the school wants to see, then the child will do well because they're getting the same messages and same instructions. But if the home culture is very different to the school culture, then the messages are different and the child will struggle at school. In Fiji and across the Pacific, we know that many of our children struggle at school. Too many fall out of the school system, and we still haven't figured out what to do with them. We can see the unrest and uncertainty, the increase in drug-related crimes, violence, a lot of violence, violence among youth, sexual violence in our homes, and family-based violence. We know, and we've known for a long time, that education is failing our children. And one of the questions that's been asked a couple of times these last 3 days is, how can we transform education? Over the last 2 decades, many Pacific educators and researchers have asked deep questions about what we can do better, but somehow we still haven't found solutions that work for our children. For too long, we have taken on the colonial legacies in development, and we've seen culture as a barrier. If you want to succeed, leave culture at the school gate. If you want to succeed, leave culture at the office door. If you want to succeed, leave culture at home. But things have started to change, And today it's very positive to see that culture is now slowly being recognized as an important part of development in the Pacific. Indigenous people see the world differently. And here we see just a very brief comparison between mainstream Western ways of seeing the world and indigenous ways of seeing the world. When we look at Western knowledge systems or mainstream knowledge systems, we can see that it's very individualistic. And many of us are very familiar with this language around the knowledge economy. But once we start talking about the knowledge economy, in the same breath that we're saying economic growth and development, once we use those words, we're putting a monetary value on knowledge. The individual is valued above the collective, and in that system, intellectual property of the individual is protected. For indigenous communities, we know that our knowledge is owned by the collective, by the group. If you're a member of the group, you know the rules about that knowledge system. You know who deserves to know what. You know which knowledges are open and which ones are sacred and secret. But the globalized world doesn't see things that way. Knowledge is power, and it's money, and it has economic and financial value. So a big part of the development story that Taitusi and I will share with you today uses this as a starting point. And it relates to indigenous wisdom. Today, our knowledge is in demand for its commercial value, and this is a big concern for those countries and communities that don't have laws and protocols to protect our knowledge. When our knowledge is not protected, external parties, individuals, companies, etc., can come in and take from us. They can trademark and copyright and patent this knowledge for themselves, and they become the legal owners of that knowledge. The world is a very dangerous place for indigenous people today. They're waking up to indigenous wisdom around climate change and adaptation, conservation, for commercialization. There's a lot of interest from pharmaceutical companies in the developed world who want to use our knowledge around herbal medicines and plants for their products. Some want to use it for cosmetics, for makeup, and others for other commercial activities. There are so many examples of how our Pacific knowledges have been appropriated by external parties, and there's no benefit that comes back to the local community. We have a few examples on this slide. Our heritage arts, our stories, our symbols, our sacred totems and practices, and even our music has been exploited. So what is our development story telling us? It's telling us that our knowledge can be exploited, and that because the systems are based on Western models, the intellectual property laws are designed to suit that model, and they focus on the individual and not the community. So we end up losing. A lot of work has been done over the years by the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and they're currently looking at finalizing 2 treaties that are meant to protect traditional knowledge. These 2 treaties have been in draft form for 23 years, basically because people can't agree on how to deal with knowledge that's collectively owned by a group. So we're hopeful that we might see an outcome from WIPO soon, but people said that 20 years ago, and people said that 10 years ago, and people said that 5 years ago. And I don't know if we'll still be saying that in another 5 or 10 or 20 years. So we need to start thinking about what we need to do to protect our knowledge systems. We've heard a lot about resilience and sustainability. For me, one of the biggest threats to our resilience and sustainability is our knowledge, the loss of our knowledge, because that connects us to place. It gives us identity and speaks to our cultural connection. If we are not able to protect traditional knowledge systems and ancient wisdoms, then what heritage are we passing on to the next generation? If we are being threatened by climate change, and some of us may need to think about relocation, how do we then hold on to this connection to ancient wisdom that we value? In the Pacific, there are 2 regional frameworks that were endorsed by ministers in 2002, and they're model laws. So one is the model law for the protection of traditional knowledge and expressions of culture, and one is the model law for the protection of traditional ecological knowledge, or knowledge about the environment. And since 2002, 3 organizations have worked with countries to support the development of their own legislature and laws. They are the Pacific Island Secretariat, PIFS, SPC, and the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP. So across the region, our people are becoming more aware that the protection of indigenous knowledge is a priority. And countries are at different stages of thinking about what they need to do to protect that knowledge. The Cook Islands has a Traditional Knowledge Act of 2013, and Vanuatu has a Protection of Traditional Knowledge and Expressions of Culture Act 2019. Vanuatu is also establishing a Vanuatu Traditional Knowledge and Expressions of Culture Authority. So to take us a little bit deeper into the next part of the development story, I'll now hand over to Taitusi to talk a little bit about culture policy.
Na kami baka rita katuk nga baka leka-lekayao Dr. Francis na may policies and may legislation so nalawa sa turawa na was Pasifika. Na nikuwa ube baka rita nga na puno sa ito tikinoviti membaleta na nonroto National Cultural Policy na Heritage Bill ulitan nga akin na Culture and Tourism Policy na ICH Framework kaya na Culture and Education Framework. Na bili ni Traditional and Ecological Bill ate kabudha na yamba kirua na undolu. Iyo sa may yada na beisaw ni matentu sa darita talangaki na kena totolo ni pastake na sonambili ko situ sa ramay na yamba kaya sa ube turo toka rosa kabul katulu na yambaki me angay te yada ni ba na Attorney General's Office na Traditional Ecological Bill. Yo darita talangaki na kenang bimbi na process ni consultation kena lako abo ki na bay talano membaleta na bill ni traditional ecological knowledge. Da baka binibela katalanga SPC na kena baka tabiteki kwa na ministry ni tamadaka kay Tokay baka talangaki norto na Department ni Heritage and Arts korto sa baka rurungitin kwa na ministry and norto to soya na nabibo sa kingwa ni Heritage Bill. Wili talangaki na National Cultural Policy. Na National Cultural Policy and doa na policy sa takabumay na kinabitala no talanga na ruwa na undolutin kandua. Yo ay na yung bakyong ko na 2023 asangay may pastakikina na bilyay na Lomani Cabinet. Iyo do talanga na kakituray na SPC na kena lako wabo kimay na consultation karasaba kay tabitakira sa rakina na kawitoke na kena draft na National Cultural Policy lebo nangunan ando ko tunga mayo ira na may banuatani meron daw may dakaba na consultation ka wala talanga iso na non the legislation wala talanga kina na bill iyo ngunang ko na National Cultural Policy araba kay tabisar nga kina na ito kikir na dakatu na matintu na kena bolaya katiko kino Dr. Francis ultra nga kino kito na chukuna department ng ono sitiko kino pa na Department of Heritage na vida na yamba kisauch. Iyo nanguna ube tukuna nga bakaleka nanguna amite kabukina na bibo sa kini National Cultural Policy e naruna undulutin kandwa lako wabo kisar nga na Bay Division na Western Division, Northern Division, ulitan nga kina na Central Division. So may narona undulutin kandua, o tiya may turi talay narona undulutin kalima, to sa chukuna bibo sa kiyaya na may na Rono ndolu rosang bulkandua me da sarango na rosang ana rono ndolu rosang bulkatolu. Andare da kinea ni singi karau to kana na navigate taka se na kanibi paseki me baleta na cultural sector. Baleta ni rauli kina na pagambibio biti ni na kina multicultural na dagaire da talangaki na nirto na veitamba na kora sema ser mena daka pa national cultural policy e chuko na non reitabi ni implementaka. Ko sa tukuna tikaya na national cultural policy e loro kina e walu na priority na walu na priority ko abu sarangame na vitala no ko sa takabumaya na rono ndolutin kandua na kinala ko abo kina na tambanan ni heritage karto wili talito nga kina vita na tambanan ni matentu kang kay develop takikina na priority ni sari da tokongori matamuni na matay ni tini todo ko na draft ni policy ni sembera ni na kena didi tiko mai nangona teka bukina bet tini kabitu tumbe kana priority sangai musu sombu tiko mai ame sar na walu ko ni sare da tongor na screen na cultural rights and heritage, sustainable cultural and natural heritage development, cultural and creative industries, ulikina na culture and tourism, sustainable funding and investment, education, training and research, cultural diplomacy, kena cultural institutions and infrastructure. Saboti ko na kena roll out takiani sana kena implementaki na itukutuku kito sa turaraw may ba na matentu ni na teka bumbe ka nakaba kay labo na ukositango sarto nang kay roll out takiani na national cultural policy menang kay viviani na bay tambana ni matentu karta na takakina na bay tambana ni matentu na kena implementaki na bay priority on isari dati kong goro kila nito sa takakati ko na tambah-tambah kay Tokay and a priority for culture and tourism na Canada kay doon na framework sa merto na develop ta ka na bay activities yaso may na address ta ka na priority for ni sari na tonggori.
One of the initiatives that PTC, through the IMR, the Institute for Mission and Research, and I can see the banner right by the door, that really, I think, triggered some thinking in me to ask the right question. And it's just that simple statement or phrase, changing the story. And so when I first started engaging with Kasi and team, this was the language that they used regularly, reframing the development story, changing the story. How do we change the story? And I don't think I've ever told you this, Kasi, but I think for the first time it was kind of like, many of us are doing that work, but we've never articulated it that way. We've never framed the words in that way. And I really liked it because it gives us permission to be active participants in our own development, instead of thinking about development as something that other people decide for us, and it just happens to us. And then all we can do is complain and wish that things were better. But by using this language, changing the story, or reframing the development story, forces us to consider, can we rethink development? And so that really is at the heart of our story today. What does it mean to rethink development in the Pacific? It means, like so many others have said, to pause and reflect. But it also means that we need to rethink and respond. Others have talked about transformational, and use the word transformational. We want to see transformational change. And when we say transformational, we mean we want to see big change. We need to see a lot of improvement. But if we pause and reflect, it gives us that opportunity to think again, to rethink before deciding on a response. And so I offer an additional word to say that we might think of responsiveness as a critical part of the journey to transformation. If we're actively working to change our story, then we're reclaiming our agency. Then we need to define the world in our own terms. We need to be able to name things for ourselves. We need to be able to use our own languages and to say the kind of development that we want, that we need, that we demand. And these are words that we don't use. So the power of language, I think, is something that we haven't quite adapted to, and maybe these are some of the questions we haven't yet realized that we can ask. So what does it mean to rethink development if we want a development story that recognizes the special relationship that our people, indigenous people and cultural communities have with the land and the sky and the sea? What does that kind of development look like? What do our laws look like? What does our legislature, our policies and our protocols, if they were to reflect us and the things that are important to us? So we also need to think about the methods and approaches that we use in development and in education. Are they relevant? So this really brings us to the heart of the presentation and the theme for today of Mbula around strategies, methods, and tools. Most of us have heard the phrase, the Pacific Way. And we all know that, okay, Ratu Mara said this at some big important meeting. So apparently in 1970, at the 25th United Nations General Assembly, Ratu Sir Kamasa Semara talked about the Pacific Way. But you all know how some of the pastors that we listen to their sermons, and they'll take one or two words out of a passage and they'll twist it to give you a completely different message, right? We've all sat through sermons like that, and you're sitting there thinking, I've read that Bible verse, and I don't think that was the message for the day. We've all sat through that. So personally, I feel like there's a little bit of this going on. All of us have heard about the Pacific Way, and all of us assume that we know what it means. But I was recently schooled in the background or context. So what was he talking about? He was talking about peaceful transition from being colonies to independence. And he was talking about that smooth, peaceful transition that several Pacific Island countries, including Fiji, had made. And he, in that statement, referred to it as the Pacific Way, right? Over the years, many people we know have continued to use the phrase, the Pacific Way, and they've each defined it in their own ways. But Ratu Mara was a statesman and a paramount chief, and he was eloquent, and he was a diplomatic speaker, right? The epitome of diplomacy, right? Polite conversation. Today we are less eloquent and less diplomatic. So if we were to ask the right question today, we might say, what is the Pacific Way of development? Surely it's not passive. Surely it's not just accepting the status quo. Surely it's recognizing that behind Ratu Mara's statement about the peaceful transition were all the stories that he wasn't sharing of resistance, of pain, of violence, of struggle that we all know the colonial era was fraught with. So in a simple phrase, he refers to the Pacific Way. How can we similarly use the Pacific Way to rethink development? How can we learn by taking time to pause and reflect, maybe on the words of Professor Epeli Hawofa in Our Sea of Islands? In his essay, Our Sea of Islands, most people reference particular verses to suit what it is they're talking about, to suit what it is they're writing about. We are the sea, we are the ocean. Oceania is vast and rising and hospitable, right? But there is a line that speaks to the angry native in me. And it's this one line: we must not allow anyone to belittle us again and take away our freedom. And it's this line that speaks to agency. It's this line that reminds us that the people have agency. So in that same context, what is the Pacific way of development? If we were to imagine that, what could it look like if it's led and driven by our people? And what can we learn from our indigenous wisdom? So at the regional level, we're shifting our story a little bit to the regional one now. We've seen some real positive shifts over the last 10 years. And we can see there's more recognition that culture is important. So if you look at regional policies and frameworks, you can see that there's a real attempt to include culture, to include traditional knowledge, and working with our indigenous communities and local people. But everyone knows that a good policy is only one part of a story, because a good policy can gather dust on the shelf, right? And the real work really begins when we start implementing. So if we focus on asking the right questions, we might think about the kind of institutions that we need, the kind of organizations that we need to help push and drive the kind of development we want to see. How might we unlearn the colonial racism and the bias that we heard about this morning and over the last 2 days? How can we unlearn this and become real Pacific institutions that recognize Pacific values, Pacific knowledge, and Pacific ways of doing? And so a question that I've been asking for a while is, can an institution be a custodian? The English words custodian or steward, and we hear about custodianship and stewardship, they talk about responsibility and they talk about roles. And it's tied to a particular place, right? But for indigenous people, or for cultural communities, when we talk about custodians, we're really talking about custodians of the land as people of the place, and your roles and responsibilities to that place. Being a custodian means building meaningful relationships, means recognizing our ecological selves, those relationships, means an emotional connection to these relationships and to the people that we serve. We need to genuinely care for them and want them to do well, not just survive. So custodianship for me is about resilience, it's about sustainability, it's about all the wonderful things that we've heard people talk about over the last 2 days. But our presentation, or our story, is an attempt to take us from the what we hope for and wish for to how might we be able to achieve this. So if development is responsive and it's driven by service, then we need to pause again. We need to reflect and we need to rethink our organizations. How can they evolve and to become institutional custodians? So we're going to move our story into the work that we do at SPC. And in the spirit of pause and reflect, we're going to pause for a moment to think about reflection. One type of reflection is called reflection in action. And when you're reflecting in action, you're doing something, but while you're doing it, you're thinking about it, and you're making changes. So if you're weaving a mat, you're paying close attention to what it is that you're doing. And if something is not quite right, you're able to fix it immediately, instead of finishing the mat and then going, well, I probably should have fixed that. You can see the opportunity to fix something or strengthen or improve it at the moment, right? Right at the moment. So that's reflection in action. Reflection on action is when we have completed a task or done something, and then we take the time to reflect on how it was done. So, for example, Winston happened, Cyclone Winston. And there are many stories about what we did well and the things that we didn't do well and the things that we could do better. So if we were pausing to reflect on action, we'd think about how we reflected to that crisis. What did we do well? What could we do better? And we learn from those past actions to help us do better in the future. Both types of reflections are so important. And we use this lens to tell Anoa about the work that we do. So Taitusi and I are both part of a program called the Culture for Development Program at SPC. And first, I suppose, before I hand over to Taitusi to tell us a little bit more about that work, a little bit of history about the organization. SPC was established in 1947. It's the oldest regional organization after the Fiji School of Medicine. So the Fiji School of Medicine was established in 1885. SPC is an intergovernmental organization with 27 member countries. 22 are Pacific Island countries and territories. On this slide, we can see the vision and values of the organization, and you can also see that culture plays a very important part of the work that we do. 4 values, excuse me, 4 values are presented in Pacific languages, and they speak to generosity, stewardship, unity, and care. In yellow at the top of the slide, we can see a reference to something called the people-centered approach. And the people-centered approach is a new way of doing the work that we do within the organization. The process for developing this strategic plan, its vision, its mission, its values, was done in close consultation with our member countries. So what you see in front of you really is a reflection of a long journey from 1947. Many lessons learned, recognizing what has worked and what hasn't worked, and now coming to a point of realization that culture, working in and with communities, and changing the way we do development is very important. So I'm going to hand over to Taitusi to take us through the next part of the story.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. Na slide nga ni Reda Tokongori, you see different areas of work at SPC. Na Culture for Development e bakarurungiti ko na Human Rights and Social Development Division. Sa bakarita ko tiao Dr. Francis, that we are the only regional organization with a dedicated culture program, and we work closely with countries. Na daka kitu bagay tabita kitu kina esanga wala nga ni technical assistance to countries wili talangaki na nito engagement at the regional and international level. So na kausa to kuno chimbale TV timbale national cultural policy na ICH framework so na kabaya kitu bagay tabita kitu kina na Culture for Development program at SPC. Kito bagay tabita kito talangay na regional meetings na kanandambe na Council of Pacific Arts and Culture, wili talangakin na culture ministers meetings. We also oversee the work around Pacific Regional Culture Strategy and the Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture. An important part of the work that we do is working on contextually relevant approaches that are responsive to cultural context by looking at Pacific approaches and methods and working with local communities. Our work is both inward and outward facing. Internally, we provide support and advice to other sections and programs who are interested in culture, and outwardly, we work with countries to support their culture goals. Na slide ni Reda Tokongori matamuni na Pacific Regional Cultural Strategy. Na strategy ngo sa paistaki sa endostaki virtu na culture ministers na mbaki sa oti. e toka kina e 5 na priorities na cultural policy framework, priority 2 na cultural heritage, cultural well-being, cultural innovation, and cultural statistics. Na priority ngo, ko sabang madalta ka kaya Dr. Francis, ito rimay na consultation na sa kawabo kinawa sa Pasifika. Kasar to Vakatutu taka kinawa sa Pasifika, Ningo na may priority e bakang bimbita ka na Pasifika may na low-ray pa na Pacific Regional Culture Strategy kasa dakatiko ini kina o SPC na Culture for Development Team na kina implementaki bata kina resource taki na dakataka ni policy ngo. Go back.
No, stop pressing.
No, it's this one. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not pressing it.
Okay, that one. That's the one.
Dua talaga na taka kito ba kita kina na Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture. Na festival ngo vei banemba ki pa kay Turkina. The first festival was hosted by Fiji and SPC in 1972. And we've had Chinkaruana festival as anda lakodrumai me nangonongo. Na festival na Chinkatuli festival na pa kay Turkina may Hawaii na June na bulot June na bakimengo. Festpac is a 2-week-long festival with a wide range of events and activities that includes heritage and contemporary arts, symposiums, conferences, workshops, arts and culture talks, performing arts, visual arts, and fashion. The Pacific Philosophies Conference that many of you have heard about is planned to take place during the festival next year in Hawaii. Over the years, many of our traditional and political leaders have reflected on the role of the Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture as a safe place for Pacific cultural communities to come together, to engage in cross-cultural sharing, and to reflect on those aspects of our cultural practice, our heritage arts and contemporary art, our stories of resilience, our language and cultural practice, our rituals and ceremonies, and their significance to our identities as Pacific peoples. Yang ada nunggu itabi na matakan ko sa nangay hendo batal chubi Dr. Francis mena wrap up takan na neuro presentation mena SPC menak.
Okay. So we come now back to that key question that I asked: can an institution be a custodian? And we're sharing with you the journey that we're taking with the organization that we work with in thinking around this concept. So SPC is recognized as the institutional custodian of the regional culture strategy and of the Festival of Pacific Arts and Culture. So what does that mean for an institution? It means that the work that we do is working directly with countries, keeping their interests at the heart of the work and believing in the value of the work. So I move now to the last part of the presentation to really get to the methods and the tools. we have something called the Social and Environmental Responsibility Policy. And this is a framework which provides some guiding principles and processes to make sure that all of our programs and projects does not do harm in the communities that we work in. So we use it to manage the social and environmental risks and impacts of all our activities in ways that are ethical and sustainable, and to try to ensure that the social and environmental benefits are achieved. It's an inclusive approach, and it uses that thing I referred to called a people-centered approach. So very briefly, what is a people-centered approach? This is also a tool or an instrument that helps us see the world in a particular way. So if we're thinking in the development space, when we apply the people-centered approach, it really is a culturally informed way of working. Here is a quick snapshot of the 4 pillars or posts: environment, human rights, gender and social inclusion, and culture. And the work that we do around the culture pillar includes culture and traditional knowledge, indigenous wisdoms, participating with local communities in designing projects and programs, in seeking their advice, in implementing and evaluating the work that we do. And we also focus on the use of local methods and approaches. So if we pause now and return to reflection, we pause and reflect and then take on a new cycle where we consult and develop. And what is it that we're developing? Developing contextual tools and instruments that draw on the wisdom of our people and from the work of indigenous researchers and the many indigenous Pacific frameworks and models that they have developed over the years. We also do this by working directly with countries. So why do we need to develop these tools? These tools are meant to help us work better in ways that respect cultural values and support relationships. We are constantly reminded that it's a privilege to do this work because it matters. It gives voice to our people and to our ways of knowing and doing, which has been ignored for too long. I joined SPC after almost 30 years in education, first as a secondary school teacher at Sila Central, and then later on at St. Joseph Secondary, and then 23 years, so 7 years of that, and then 23 years at USP. It was a very difficult decision to leave education. I'd spent the bulk of my time training teachers, developing teachers, focusing on teacher education, looking at the role that culture plays in education, looking at the role that culture plays in research, teaching undergrad and postgrad students, supervising master's and PhD students. But if I'm completely honest, one of the main reasons that I knew it was a good idea to move after such a long career is this organizational philosophy. That you can exist in a space where your own values and the values of the communities that if you can work, sorry, I need to rephrase that. If you can work in an organization where your values and the values and passions that you have for the communities that you serve are also highlighted, are also emphasized, are also supported, what a wonderful world it would be, right? If we could all have that experience. So I can't take credit, Taitosi and I can't take credit for this work. The organization turned 75 a couple of years ago. It's come a long way. It's mature now. It's an elder, right? But we are very privileged to be part of a wider community of practice, of individuals and groups in an organization that is thinking, reflecting, rethinking how it's working in community, what it can do better, and recognizing that culture is at the heart of what it means to be Pacific. And so what then does it mean to be a Pacific institution, to be a custodian institution? And so we know that we're only a small part of a very long journey that began before us and will continue when we have moved on. And that this journey will continue to be shaped by all of the lessons learned along the way. So we hope that our story about the work that we do might help inspire you to think about the work that you do, to think about the recommendations that you put forward this afternoon, about the next steps. We know our values and our wisdoms, are important. We know that we don't want to lose them, but how do we reshape and rethink development that meets our needs? What does that look like? So here on my very last slide, it's a final provocation or a challenge. The academics in the room and the students in the room will be familiar with the Vanua framework. And I'm using this opportunity to pause, reflect, so that we might respond and transform. So in 2016, I was still at USP, and my students were really struggling with Pacific ideas, only because they had been colonized so well that they'd learned only to value books and articles and theories and research approaches and models from elsewhere. And so one of the ways that I tried to get them interested was to create these little visuals with quotations on them, and images, so that they might see themselves and realize that we do have philosophies and knowledge systems of value too. So on this slide, we have a brief summary of the Vanua framework that was first introduced in academia by the late Professor Asisela Ravuvu, 1980, who talked about the indigenous Itauke worldview. And then, of course, the theologians in the room will be familiar with the brilliant work of the late Reverend Tuwere around contextual theology. And then later on, we had Professor Unaisi Nambombo Mbamba, who spoke to us on Monday, who really took it to the next level to say, we can use this framework to really understand the indigenous Itauke worldview, our spirituality, our connectedness, and we can use it to frame the research we do in our communities. So it's used as a metaphor of the land as place and space, and I don't need to go on, you know this. But the question, if I'm going to ask the right question, a question might be, what is its application to development? In the quote that you can see, and I hope that you can see it, Professor Una is talking about research. But what if we use this opportunity to ask the right question about development? What if development was based and embedded as well as framed in Vanua identities, in cultures, in languages, in ways and philosophies of knowledge? Can we just imagine that for a moment? What would it look like? What changes would we need to see? What might development look like for everyone in society where no one is left behind? Where we recognize, respect, and value the special relationship that indigenous people have with the land, and at the same time provide for all relationships and connections of other members of society who are now part of the Vanua. What might development look like if we could address the issues related to the social ills that we see in our society, the violence, the substance abuse, unemployment, the crime? What could development for resilience really look like? What would education look like? What would agriculture look like? What would fisheries look like? What would our ideas about social welfare look like? And finally, coming back to the SPC story that we had shared, what kinds of institutional custodians do we need? What are these institutional custodians that will help us achieve the kind of progress and development that our people need and deserve? Vinaka.